Hello, everyone, and welcome to Democracy in 5 Minutes. I'm your host, Paul Manna, here in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I'm a professor of government and public policy at William & Mary. The last couple of weeks, we've been discussing the role that courts play in keeping democracy strong. Today, I'd like to get into a specific topic that has been occupying the courts a great deal lately. It's the issue of due process. This idea has come up most frequently in recent court cases and coverage of the Trump administration's immigration policies. That's just one important example. Because due process ties into so many things, I wanted to take today's episode to discuss the idea. Hopefully by the end, you'll have a better understanding of what due process involves and why it's so important. So let's dive in and get that conversation rolling. I want to start with the question of what does due process actually mean? Simply stated, due process means that the government must follow certain procedures when it acts. Those procedures exist in many contexts. Before you are ordered to pay for a speeding ticket or a parking ticket, for example, you are afforded the chance to challenge it in some sort of official proceeding like traffic court. Or perhaps you're a contractor performing a service for the government, like constructing a new building or maintaining the lawn of a government facility. The government can't simply refuse to pay you for your services without allowing you a chance to challenge the rationale for that non-payment. You can sue the government to obtain the payment that you believe is rightfully yours. This idea of due process goes to the heart of much of the immigration news that has dominated the airwaves and the internet in recent weeks and months. People have complained about the behavior of officers within the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, for example, by arguing they have apprehended, detained, and in some cases sent people out of the country without affording them an opportunity to challenge the government's actions. In other words, advocates for these people who have been held by the government are arguing there has been no due process to assess whether ICE's actions are supported by the law and by evidence. So hopefully that helps you better understand what due process means. An obvious follow-up question one could pose is, where does the idea of due process come from in the first place? In the context of American democracy, at least, we see it prominently displayed in the U.S. Constitution. It appears in two parts, in fact. Initially, it was part of the original Bill of Rights in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The key excerpt from that amendment says, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The idea of due process was so important that it also came up again nearly a century later when the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment includes similar language, but here it compels the states to provide due process. When originally written, remember, the Fifth Amendment only constrained the national government. That similar language in the 14th Amendment reads, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Now, students of the founding of the U.S. will recognize that the due process language in the Fifth and 14th Amendments reaches back even farther in time before the nation even adopted the Constitution. The emphasis on, quote, life and liberty, which due process is designed to protect, comes straight out of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, in that revolutionary document, the colonists in 1776 noted that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable rights inherent in the people themselves. In other words, governments don't give out those rights, the people are born with them. So, based on that understanding of the origin of the due process idea, you can hopefully start to see why it is so essential in democracies. If a person's right to life and liberty ultimately come from a higher power, as the founders noted, not the government itself, then the government better be on very strong ground if it acts to deny those things to anyone. The way that the government makes its case and the way it allows the people to defend their rights is by ensuring that the people have due process. Further, the requirement that governments follow due process recognizes an obvious reality. The government can make mistakes. Government officials might accuse someone of a crime, for example, but have the wrong person due to a case of mistaken identity. Without due process, it would be impossible to correct those errors. The recognition that government itself is prone to errors was something that the authors of the U.S. Constitution understood very well. It's the reason why they and others since then have said that the U.S. is a nation of laws and not men. Men and women, by their nature, are error-prone. Nobody is perfect. We don't simply trust that the government is always right when it makes certain decisions, especially decisions that might deprive people of life, liberty, or property. Due process acts as an important shield then to protect the people when the government acts but might make mistakes that bear on their freedoms. So, what can you do with this information from today? Let me suggest that you use these ideas as a filter to help you understand what today's debates over due process are all about. When you see stories in the news that discuss due process, ask yourself these questions. First, who is claiming that their due process rights have been violated, and what is the basis for that violation? Second, what is the government's response to those claims? And in responding, what has the government affirmed that it has done to provide due process? Or has the government deflected the question and simply asked that people trust its judgment? Third, in instances where judges are hearing cases about the denial of due process, what sorts of issues are judges highlighting in their rulings that help elaborate the meaning and extent of due process protections? Hopefully those questions will help guide your thinking about due process. Because it's such a huge idea, I want to stay on this topic again next week, and so in our next episode we'll address the question, who is entitled to due process? We've seen this question debated frequently in the news, and so I want to explore it in more detail. Until then, take good care, folks. I'll be back with you soon. Bye-bye.